Okay. Thank you all for having me here. Jermaine, thanks for the invitation. dieDAS, I really appreciate being here. This is the tail end of a long 2-week trip for me. I took my family and my wonderful fiance, hey, what's up, baby? To Italy for a few weeks. My parents hadn't been back in 30 years. I used to live in Sicily when I was young. I became an architect because I lived in Comiso and Ragusa for about 2 years, in between the economy, the kind of main downtown, and this NATO Air Force Base, this air station that was placed down in the southeast part of Sicily. It was there because of war. It held nuclear warheads, and while I was there, I learned so much. I learned why I wanted to be an architect, because coming from Trenton, New Jersey, I don't know if anybody's been to Trenton, New Jersey, and or Sicily. They're very different places. So if you get a chance, go to Trenton or go to Sicily, pick one. But the reason I kind of bring that story up, one is that, again, you'll hear me say this a lot. We leave the residue or the remnant of our own kind of imagination of place in the spaces and places that shape us. It's the reason that we kind of go back to the stories of our past, so that the kind of culture that defines us allows us to kind of move forward in a particular direction. I say that because last year, I went back to one of the houses I lived in. That NATO base closed in 1990. No one else lived in the house after us. We went back last year, 32 years later, and the keys were still in the door. I got 5 of them, one for all of my family members. And I carry this with me. It's a memento for me. It's a small little monument that I keep with me that reminds me of not just why I started to think about architecture as a profession to move forward in, but it also reminds me of a place that shaped how I think about place and space writ large. And so I hold on to this pretty consistently. It's with me all the time. If you ever see me, I have an extra one if you want to keep it or hold it or sorry. Let me wind that back. You cannot keep my key. But if you want to see it, if you want to touch it, I'll pass it around a little bit later on. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So why am I here? What do we do? I am a design justice practitioner. Now, design justice, you'll see over here, kind of really talks about a few things. One, I'll start with the negative, work to the positive. We are seeking to challenge the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design to sustain and maintain systems of oppression. Right? That's first and foremost. Secondarily, we're seeking to forward a radical or explore a radical liberatory vision of racial, social, and cultural reparation through the process and outcomes of design. Now, you see a couple of these things underlined over here. I say radical because oftentimes people think of radical and they go with the extremes, right? We don't think about the etymology of the word radish, right? We're just trying to get to the root. Right? We're trying to get to the root of a particular issue before we start to make solutions about a thing. We say reparation because everything is about healing, right? The kind of reaper of this world tends to think that this world is one that moves through entropy, and our focus, our purpose then is to continue to heal as we move things forward. I say process and outcomes because it's necessary for us not just to have a pretty building or a pretty space at the end of this, but a process that is necessarily connected to the people who occupy those spaces and places that we are thinking about designing. And then lastly, I want to talk about a quote by Polygon Allen, which says that the loss of memory is the root of all oppression. Right? The loss of memory is the root of all oppression. So in this work, we're really essentially saying that if the loss of memory is the root of all oppression, then it stands to reason that a relentless pursuit of memory making is the foundation of a truthful and just and joyful collective experience. Right? And so our pursuit is to not only make beautiful things, but is to remember well enough, precisely enough, and expansively enough to remove oppression as an option in our daily pursuits. So This work then I'm going to briefly kind of go through a couple of these things and then just kind of ground you in what we're doing, and then we'll kind of move into some of the work and how it manifests. This work is grounded in power, values, care, and culture. When I talk about power, I often refer to a Malcolm X quote. It talks about the history of all revolutions is based in blood and land. It is the landless versus the landlord, right? Values. Our collective values are validated through the spaces and places that we design. Care. So design justice is what love looks like in public spaces. This is cribbed off of a Dr. Cornel West quote. But the intention there is just to understand that if we are trying to design for beloved communities, or communities that either we are a part of or communities that we care deeply about, it requires us to have a shared experience. And so the more we create spaces that allow us to have more shared experiences, the more connected we will ultimately be. Culture, again, is the consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate condition. I'll talk more about this briefly. This notion that culture is the sum of the kind of moments in memory that are constantly guiding us back to a truth of our collective selves, it means that for us, culture is the consequence of a persistent circumstance and immediate condition. It is the sum of the large things that we all collectively have to deal with and the small things that individually or our group or our tribe end up having to deal with on a daily basis. Culture is shaped by those things. Now, sometimes I get knocked because this feels sometimes like a negative connotation. I don't feel as though it is that way, but culture is a way for us to kind of subtly adapt to the changes in places and spaces. I had a roommate of mine when I first moved to New Orleans, and we had this conversation about the fact that when I was young, I used to go to the side door or the back door of my grandmother's house all the time. That was how we went into the house. Every black family I knew, every black person I knew, if you had a side door or a back door, that's the door you went through. Why? I didn't know when I was 7, had no idea. But we talked about it as we get older and we start to do this research, we understand that it is vestigial of a history of oppression. It is vestigial of a history of slavery and enslavement and indentured servitude, right? And so if you are then forced to go through a certain space every single day, you create a new pattern, a new habit, a new routine every single day, it starts to become form, right? And so essentially what we're saying is that culture is then shaped as a byproduct of the kind of collective circumstances that people have to go through in order to survive, right? And so we make those things joyful, but they are indeed something that often start with a survival, right? So I want to talk a little bit about how that then starts to move itself towards an architecture of memory. Again, I mentioned that oftentimes those forces, those isms, those biased powers, that might be environmental, geographic, social, political, whatever those forces may be, they start to impose on a community. That community then forms, again, shapes patterns and reacts to those forces in some capacity to protect itself, right? Those patterns then last oftentimes long outlasting the biases or the forces themselves, and we create a culture that is then formed from that. That culture may look like something in New Orleans in which we have Mardi Gras Day. How many people have been to New Orleans? Couple, a few, maybe? Okay, great. Well, New Orleans, there are Mardi Gras Indians, and sometimes that sounds offensive to people because black people in New Orleans are not the indigenous native community. But if you know that enslaved Africans made passage to freedom by way of indigenous tribes, you know that the Mardi Gras Indian culture is a byproduct of honoring those who helped them survive. So to this day, the beating, the feathers, the kind of pageantry of Mardi Gras Indians is a byproduct of a cultural trauma that got turned into a cultural joy. So when you come to New Orleans and you celebrate it, you understand that there's this beautiful moment, but it is also rooted in something that had such a hardship for people. And so the kind of spatial identity, the kind of architecture of memory is a byproduct of those patterns and habits, routines, and us creating more spaces for that to happen on a more consistent basis. So I'm going to give you a little bit of conversation around a couple places in New Orleans, mostly the Treme, and I'll tell you why here briefly. But before I get there, New Orleans has to deal with a series, like I said, of different forces that are applied to it. Whether it's environmental, most of you have heard of Hurricane Katrina, kind of aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Jermaine just mentioned a little bit about the impact of kind of environmental conditions on a place. The impact after post-Katrina meant that we lost 50,000 occupiable housing units across the city. Devastating. We lost about 300,000 people out of the city right after Katrina. So it took about 10 to 15 years before we were able to get even close to the full number of people that were there pre-Katrina. So it was about 472,000 people. We're at about 400,000 people today, right? A little less. But the damage in the Ninth Ward alone, this is just maybe a quarter of the city, we saw about 4,000 homes demolished, wiped off the face of the earth, and about 1,400 people died in this small little area of New Orleans. New Orleans is a small city in general. It's bigger in our hearts, but. So part of the reaction to that was one project called Lights Out. You mentioned this a little earlier, but Amani Jacqueline Brown and I, a good friend of ours, we started a project called Lights Out, which is really a conversation around what investment back into a land structure, a development structure that essentially focused on those who had the right to return back to the city post-Katrina. We did this by really trying to buy property post-Katrina, unpacking and untangling the system. So our intention was to create a product that started to have conversations in public, right? So we started to run for mayor. So we ran for mayor and we ran for president. And in doing so, what we did was hold essentially policy meetings underneath a billboard once a month. And we would talk about specific topics around housing in the city, unpacking that with 30, 40 people in a workshop basically every single week. And then we would live stream that and send that back out to people. That's a brief project. One project that you all have probably heard of, or at least not project, but at least situation that you've probably all heard of. Again, Jermaine just mentioned, and I'm going to try my best not to say the same exact words as Jermaine here, but Jermaine mentioned Robert E. Lee. So Robert E. Lee was one of the tallest statues in the city of New Orleans for 150 years. The man never stepped foot in the city, owned 190 human beings. On his deathbed, and this is what I'll get from the racists in New Orleans, they'll often say, well, he apologized on his deathbed, and you should let it go. And I won't go too far into what I say in response to that, but no is generally the answer. I will not let it go. And so this was the day that we removed Robert E. Lee from the pedestal in New Orleans. I want to talk about this because there's this conversation that we're going to have today is about the continuum of memory. And this was a moment in time, a moment that was so joyful because not just because we got a chance to take down a racist Confederate monument, but because the effort and time it took to take down that racist Confederate monument took 30 years of our elders and ancestors attempting to remove this, us protesting for 2 years in the streets consistently. Standing, all of the people that you saw in Virginia and across the country with guns, they started in New Orleans. See, we didn't have cameras back then. So in 2014 and 15, all of the people with the AK-47s were at our protests. Were following us around with new flags. Somehow they had a printmaking flag maker around with them. They made a new flag every single day. It was ridiculous. But ultimately, these are the faces that you saw on a consistent basis. And this moment was so joyful because we didn't know it was going to happen. We didn't know that we were going to get to have this monument come down at this particular time. It was a battle. And so the 4 monuments that came down, by this time we saw the defeat in their faces and the joy came out. We drank, I don't drink alcohol, but they drank every bottle of wine and champagne out of the grocery store and the gas station right at the corner of this street. And it was a beautiful, beautiful moment. So Lee Circle turned to Free Circle in an instant. As a byproduct of that conversation, and again, I'm showing you projects that are in response to some of these issues. So whether it be the environmental of Hurricane Katrina or the kind of political and socio-cultural of the kind of monuments conversation, this is a project called Paper Monuments. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but this is a public conversation. We talked to over 15,000 people across the city of New Orleans to ask them, can you imagine what new monuments to New Orleans might look like? Ones that are not focused on the repetition of taking one white man on a horse down and putting another white man in a car up. And what does it mean for us to talk about the more kind of collective experience? We do nothing in this world alone. Right? We do nothing in this world alone. So can we talk about the events, the people, the places, the movements that shape our city and have an honest conversation about that? And the only way to do that is to expand the conversation point beyond the 70 to 100 people who usually get to define what public space looks like, right? And so that's what we did. We had about 1,500 people end up 1,500 people end up giving us different proposals for what they think new monuments might look like. And our public dialogue meant that we actually put these proposals back up in the street. We pasted them across the city and made sure that those conversations continue to happen for over 2 years across the city. Some of those conversations really dealt with the kind of spectrum, broad spectrum of what culture might look like, what family, what legacy looks like, what the kind of women who define the strength of the city look like. And so these are some proposals that you'll see, ranging from a 13-year-old to a 50-year-old. The broad spectrum of conversations needed to be put in place so that we could actually have deeper conversations. Those conversations led to a series of kind of contemporary posters that we used to have, again, more public dialogue across the city. One of the reasons we did this, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about this briefly, is because the kind of tactile and haptic consideration of a poster or a leaflet or a flyer meant that we could have more conversations quicker, right? This wasn't the end goal. This was the starting point for more broader conversations. Those things went public. We put a lot of those things out in public spaces so that people could not only talk about kind of historical context. This is a poster around the original indigenous tribe of Chapatoulas in New Orleans. This is a series of community members on Algiers Point in New Orleans across the river. And it's both talking about historical context and the kind of contemporary context of the city now. So who do we honor? Do we only honor our history, or do we honor our present as well? How do we start to visualize these stories, the absurdist in them and the kind of real in them? This was talking about, this is one of our kind of central parks in the city. What would happen if we let the ecology of the city take over and we lived with it? What would happen if instead of Robert E. Lee, we had a gramophone up on Robert E. Lee's pedestal? To the more sincere a memorial to those who were enslaved right there in New Orleans on a consistent basis. So all of these start to depict and tell a broader story of what people wanted to see. This was our attempt at kind of translating some of those voices into more direct ideas. So the point of this is to really start to talk about how we make meaning of place. I'm going to talk about the Treme because a few major things happen there. It kind of sums up a lot of what the story of the city is. Read a couple of these quotes. The present is the point in which time touches eternity. This presentation was really titled Continuum of Memory for a reason, because all of these things, the moment a moment happens, it starts to ascend to myth, right? We start to forget bits and pieces of it. Everyone has their own little story about it. And the accumulation of those stories starts to create a story that is either closer to the truth or further away from the truth. And the further away we get, the more expanded that gets. So I'm going to talk about each of these. We start in a moment, whether it's this moment. I told you a little bit about a memento, right? I kept a memento from my story, but each story, each place that we go to, I'm assuming the fellows will probably take something from here that will remind you of this place on a consistent basis. So a couple moments to talk through. This is the city of New Orleans in 1798. The Treme area sits right on the outside of the city. This is the main city in New Orleans. This is what everyone thinks of as New Orleans. So if you see the images, the pictures, you often see the French Quarter. That's what you're seeing right here. The Treme sits right on the outskirts of that. Most of my projects that I'm going to talk to you about today are centralized in this area. I've worked in the Treme for about 13 years since I moved to the city of New Orleans. So this gives you kind of a map. The thing to recognize here is both the river and the bayous from above is the way in which the city was formed. So much of the indigenous kind of tribes and culture and trade happened from the north of the city coming down towards the city, right? And so a lot of trade happened in this particular area. So a lot of our projects also end up happening in that area. On the outside of this area as well is what you call back of town. A back of town, when you have an area of the city in which people, those with money can exist, that's this French Quarter. Back of town is where everyone else was forced to live, right? Okay. So Congo Square. Congo Square, so New Orleans has this kind of complex history of having enslaved Africans and free Africans in the city over time, and it went kind of back and forth depending on the year we're talking about. But this is an image in reference to Congo Square. I wasn't able to trace this back to Congo Square specifically, so I don't want to say that it is exactly that, but that's what it was supposed to be depicting. Congo Square was the one space on Sundays when Black people in New Orleans were able to come and trade, to celebrate, to be spiritual, and to share with loved ones. In 1931, we started to see the state of Louisiana start to impose a project called the Municipal Auditorium on that particular neighborhood, right on the most sacred grounds, right? Most sacred of all grounds, in the blackest neighborhood in the city. Now, the Treme historically was, again, the blackest city in the country at the time, the blackest neighborhood in the country, and this was seen at the time to be obviously an offense at that moment, right? So one other thing that happened at just a few years later, in the 1956 to 1967, give or take, you started to see the push for a highway to cut through the quarter. Now, this is post Moses losing his battle to Jane Jacobs in New York. Tail tucked between his legs, came down to New Orleans and other places and attempted to kind of expand the idea. And this is what happened. They attempted to put a highway right through the French Quarter, the oldest, one of the kind of older neighborhoods in the city, obviously. And what you see here is that kind of condition. And so, because there was a political power that existed within the context of the Bouquerie, within the context of the old city, they were able to push back that highway to, you guessed it, to the black neighborhood, right? And so that's what happened. You saw a highway cut directly through. So the French Quarter is this way. You saw a highway cut straight through the heart of the Treme. And through that, what you see often is that we are forced to, culture is the consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate condition, right? It forces us to kind of heal, to find new ways to survive, new ways to live. That's what you saw happen. You saw over time, people found a new way to survive and thrive. So, form follows fiction. something an earlier speaker said was that we don't often have the time or the space or the kind of we haven't been given necessarily, those who have been marginalized have not been given the space to be able to hold down the things that we care most about as a truth in our spaces, right? And so when we talk about form follows fiction, it is to say that the narratives of a people who have been historically marginalized and historically disinherited need to be followed as much as the kind of physicality of space that exists otherwise, right? Oftentimes in preservationist conversations, we always get the conversation that, well, if it no longer stands, how do we honor, or how do we hold it to be a truth? And I think it lives in the people, and if you understand that it lives in the people, if you understand that it lives in the Miss Marys, the Miss Ellens on the block, you know that you can pull those stories and recreate. You can start to reconfigure what new spaces might look like as a byproduct of that. So this is a project that we did called Remember When, Remember Then. It's a small kind of art piece with the African American Museum in New Orleans. It's a lenticular, but the intention was to collage that really talks about the kind of history of the city, both going forward and backward. Let's see. Okay, you can see both. All right. So with the African American Museum, shut down for about 10 years, again, post-Katrina, never really recovered. We used this piece as a means to kind of start to bring people back to place. And as a part of the Paper Monuments project, we started to actually tell this story on walking tours and make sure that people kind of understood that, again, both the kind of historical context of the Treme proper, but the highways that cut through the municipal auditorium, all of those issues that the city or this neighborhood was facing, the depletion of population over time, all of those things were starting to be brought up through the conversations that were put with this piece. Also in this neighborhood is a project, or say a greenway called the Lafitte Greenway. It is the extension of the bayou that I mentioned a bit earlier, where you saw that big kind of red outlined space. The bayou is a place of trade. It is where a lot of kind of indigenous communities found their route back down to the river, right? And so there's a series of projects called the Storia projects that are indeed monuments, memorials to those stories, to those conversations around. This is a project called Delta that we are working on and is going to go in construction here in the fall, that is really talking about what the history of the bayou is, what the history of the Greenway is, and how indigenous people, both then and now, right, because indigenous people, especially in the States, still exist. And we want to make sure that those stories are the ones that are lifted and raised in this particular context. So this is a bridge that crosses over from a walkway over into another park and allows for some of those narratives to be directed and for people to have to engage with those truths as we move through. These are smaller kind of pavilion projects, and I'll tell you why we do those here briefly. This is a project at the African American Museum called DFRAG. It is about, this project was about kind of ecological displacement and indigenous displacement. This is about kind of community and cultural displacement. DFRAG is in the Treme. It is a place that went from about 30,000 people to around 5,000 people in terms of total population. The density of the housing went way down. The cost of the housing went way up. And so fewer people are able to live there. STRs, or short-term rentals, have essentially vacated most of this kind of historically cultural neighborhood. And so that's what this conversation, this kind of monument to that is attempting to do. It's also attempting to be a pavilion that brings people back to place. So one additional project, which I had mentioned a little bit earlier, the municipal auditorium, is one that I really want to kind of take a beat on. About 2 years ago, the mayor of the city of New Orleans decided that they were going to move City Hall to that same place, municipal auditorium, the sacred ground of Congo Square. Now, what comes with a city hall? It comes with cops, it comes with lawyers, it comes with policymakers, and most importantly, it comes with barriers, right? It comes with barriers to access, right? And so the intention of the community who rose up in that particular moment, nearly 20 different organizations rose up and started to organize around the mayor of the city not moving City Hall to this location, and instead proposing a new idea. So a lot of the work that we end up doing is speculative in the nature that we work with organizations to counter default solutions from public entities, right? And so this project, I love this quote by Alex Haley, which is, when a griot dies, a library burns to the ground. You see that I have this as Alex Haley and Amadou Habatiba, right? When I said that we go from moments to myth, this is the quote that kind of generated that idea. This is a quote from Alex Haley in the book Roots, late 60s, early 70s. Some of you might know it. But the actual quote happened at the UN many years before by Amadou Habatiba, and it doesn't say this at all. It really talks about the lack of, it was really, Amadou Habatiba was trying to preserve kind of African kind of tradition and cultural artifact through the UN. And the quote talks about the loss of traditionalists, griots, right? The loss of traditionalists means that we are losing so much knowledge that it is hard to recover from. So that's what this is. This was a conversation around, instead of transitioning this space to an unoccupiable space of a city hall where people won't be able to occupy or engage with, let's turn it into a cultural complex, one that people kind of have access to on a daily basis. And so that's what we did. We worked with community members for nearly a year to develop a program, to develop a strategy, both from a financial standpoint and from an architectural standpoint, that allowed for us to kind of reclaim the park itself, redesigned with community's voice at the forefront, reconnect the streets of the neighborhoods and the community, to honor some of the projects that had already been proposed by much of the community members, to, again, like I said, reconnect some of the major streets. This is one of the only parks in the city that is locked at night. It has chains, it is kind of blocked up. You can guess why that is. It is in, again, historically African-American neighborhoods, so it is inaccessible even in those particular moments. So the reason I talked to you a little bit about those spaces, media markers, monuments, in large part because the tactile, the haptic, the things that we can occupy that are objects in space allow us to expand a story and narrative, but they are oftentimes either propaganda or informational. They don't allow us to kind of expand narratives in real ways. And so I want to make sure that when we start to think about the kind of occupiable space, we tell more complex stories. And so that's what this one is. We're talking about the spatial imaginary of a project called the Claiborne Innovation District. This is a quote by Bell Hooks: "The diaspora is an act of will and memory." The Claiborne Innovation District is a project that, as I mentioned, starts to try to rethread this highway that cut the Treme in two, right? Bifurcated it. We lost 400 live oak trees. This is a thriving black business corridor, about 400 black businesses. About 350 went away in the 10 years in which the highway was kind of amassed. And just about 50 are still alive today. So it's still a struggling neighborhood as a byproduct of this particular pursuit. Now, just like any scar on yourself, on your body, it heals over and you learn to live with it. And that's what the community has done. That's what we have done. But we've worked to kind of tell more kind of consistent stories. This is a workshop in which we allowed community members who had been around both prior to the highway, so some of our elders and folks who were there right after, to tell stories about what were the businesses and locations that existed in this place from that time forward. How do we start to recreate and or revive or honor the things that still exist in this city? We talked to our elders, like I said, we talked to our youth. In the city, we held a bunch of kind of youth workshops, and as a previous speaker said, it is very hard to deal, to work in community, especially if you don't intend on being a part of that community, right? If you don't intend, they can feel it. Community members can feel it, I can feel it, right? And so the point was to make sure that we are both hiring and working with as many community members as possible in the outcomes of those designs, even the small pieces. This was a small, very, very quick installation piece that we worked on with some of those same community members to eventually get to a design set that starts to encompass the highway, to rethread some of those elements back into the fabric of this particular neighborhood, and to think about not just the fact that we want to put new businesses back, but this is one of those kind of critical conversations around businesses in New Orleans, that because a history of violence and oppression in the city meant that Black and brown businesses, 95% of Black and brown businesses are 1 to 3 people throughout their entirety, meaning that they are beta businesses. They don't necessarily have the capacity or dollars to lease out a space and maintain that lease space over time. And so we needed to create a different model for folks to reside within. So creating spaces that they didn't have to pay continued rent on, that they weren't having to pay an annual kind of increase in property tax every single year. That's what the point of this is. Yeah. And so the wrap up of this is that this project is 60 years in the making. We've officially received $2 million to go ahead and put the first phase of this in the ground. We start next year with construction, and it's been a beautiful process, but it is one that is a result of us being able to hold on to that history, hold on to those stories, and to create something that was a direct reflection of those, the memory of those projects before us. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you. No, we have a Q&A. You have to answer some questions. I hope there are some. But actually, I would like to use the privilege of holding the microphone to ask the first question, or make a short statement also about something that Jermaine said earlier, that, of course, this is a kind of like special context and situation that we're here now, because like many of us couldn't be here like during the time this place was built, especially ideologically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so the short, it's maybe we could probably discuss about this longer. So we don't have so much time. But I was wondering, now you're here for the first time, experiencing this place, and like coming out from your work experience and those very interesting, incredible projects you're working on, what would your idea, or what's your feeling about this particular space here? Yeah,
so this is a great question, because I get this a lot in New Orleans. Oftentimes people will say, where do you draw the line, right? Do you want to take down the monuments? Or yes, I want to take down all of the monuments. So what? But do you do that at the scale of the building? Well, maybe not. Maybe there is a way in which you seed and occupy. I think this is a conversation that, I'm glad that we're having publicly, because the solutions haven't necessarily been played out all the way through. We're talking about memory in the sense that it's growing anew all the time. And so when I think about this space, I think about what will happen once it starts to be excavated to a point that the things that need to be revealed are revealed, that it germinates new opportunities for new stories and new histories to be told. I was sitting here this whole time, and I keep seeing this plaque, and I keep seeing, I feel like I can't tell, but it looks like a Black man on that. So like there's weird things that I wanna know, I wanna start to pull out. Now, do you just eliminate all of it? maybe not. I think you have to have the ability to sow that and have those conversations. So I would say keep as many spaces as possible that you can tell full, enriching stories. And if people don't want you to tell the full story, then burn it down.
Thank you so much. Are there more? Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind of deep and transformative understanding from a European perspective. I think that both you and Jermaine bring out a lot of issues that are also universal. So my question is a very worm's eye question. I'm moved by all the conversation and discussion, but I'm one for getting things done quicker and faster, and also in a way that's not the past. So my question to both of you, in fact, is what are the barriers that are stopping you practicing in the normative? Because the institutions that you are both belonging to, which is architecture, and the rules of the game from development and construction, certainly in the European context, we see as a massive barrier. It's not just the climate, but it's getting the opportunity to actually make something. It doesn't have to be a community project, but it has to be something that you two believe in. So I'd be very interested to hear how you might answer that universally. For example, in Asia and places, because some of the things you're saying are human, is not specific to what you're doing. So if we're going to build a project together, and I'd love to very quickly with both of you, I'm a structural engineer, and we're parasites. So what we want to do is get on with it, right? So what are the barriers that I could help break?
I mean, I think there are a couple barriers. One that you won't be able to break, because I think it's people, right? Like people take time. People are complex, and so I think that one is always going to be that's always going to extend the pace. But we often talk about 6 Ps. So pedagogy. Write this down if you want. Pedagogy, policies, procedures, practice, project, people. Right. That is the way in which architecture, as we are currently taught, or design justice, can attack. So when we think about, I'll give you a for instance. Right now you're starting to see a lot of design justice language across a lot of universities, and some kind of practices are starting to imbue that into the institutional curriculum, and that is a beautiful thing. But that in and of itself is not the kind of total that'll get us there quickly. But I used to work for the city of New Orleans. The policies and the procedures are the quickest way to kind of move things forward. One of the greatest things I could ever understand is the difference between a policy and a procedure, the idea that the ideal of an ordinance or a policy itself is different than the implementation of that policy itself. So, so noting that, for instance, most cities send out RFPs or RFQs, and they're kind of templated. One of the things that we were able to do as a practice was to rewrite RFP structures, rewrite RFQs, and send them to different cities and say, this is actually how you should be thinking about process. We got a bunch of projects. So we have an office in New Orleans and one in Portland, Oregon. Just a brief story. We essentially helped to recraft the RFP structure in 2017-18 in a few institutions in Portland, Oregon. There was about $32 million worth of projects that were focused on design justice and critical race theory in 2019. Today, there are about $5 billion worth of work that are crafted around design justice and critical race theory. It took about 3 years to get projects that allow us to do the type of work that we want to do at this scale. So it's not extremely hard. I mean, that's the worst thing about systems and the most beautiful things about systems, right? The worst thing about systems is obviously that they're massive and they're hard to kind of shift and change. The beautiful thing is that they're dumb. Oftentimes they use components so that they can churn out the same thing over and over again. And so if you know where you can operate and change those pieces, you can fully fundamentally change the outputs of those systems. And so for us, it is, let's change the RFPs, let's change the requests of designers, of architects, of structural engineers, so that the outputs reflect the type of work that we're attempting to get done. And that's happening. It just takes a long time to put a building up. So you'll see. Next time these slides will all be real. Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question about something that happened recently in the United States, and that was the environmental disaster in Lahaina. And I think about the utter complete loss of the entire community and how much memory that community holds. And I'd love to have you hypothetically think about, like, what would your process be, and hope that this process perhaps is something that can bring back design justice, because all of us fear that developers are going to get in there and turn it back and turn it into a space that's unrecognizable.
Yeah.
So could you talk about that for a sec?
It's a heartbreaking question because, again, we dealt with this in New Orleans. Like, disaster capitalism is something that kind of it's a byproduct of capitalism. And so I don't have an immediate answer, but I know that it took us 15 years to heal. And I would say not even heal. People have told us that we are hyper resilient as a city. We're a resilient city in New Orleans. And I think Lahaina, people will say the same thing, right? But people get tired of being that, and so we have to not just create spaces, but create processes that allow people to heal in the process. So it can't be, and this is, I guess, maybe the kind of truth in the answer would actually be, you have to start small, you have to build small things before you build big things. When people are hurt, they need small steps. So the reason we made posters is not because we wanted to just make posters. It's because we needed to have real conversations. The reason we make pavilions and small art installations is not because that's the end result. It's because those are smaller conversational pieces that allow us to build trust and to build to that larger inevitable position. So it takes a lot longer, and I think that's what's going to have to happen, the slow, steady process of building and rebuilding trust and making sure that those who are indigenous know that at any given moment, the switch is not going to flip, and again, a series of developers are not just going to come in and turn the whole thing upside down, which is, again, partly what happened in New Orleans. It's why we are still struggling as a city. So I don't know that it's the right answer, but I know that that's what I've seen work in the past, and every place has its own processes to work. So thank you for the question. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Bryan.
You're very welcome. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.